In the early 1900s, millions of Americans didn't live in apartments or suburbs. They lived in boarding houses, places where strangers shared walls, secrets, and sometimes even their lives. Behind these doors, love affairs, scandals, and silent tragedies unfolded every night. And most of these stories were never written down.
Bess learned through experience, yet her presence was a constant reassurance that someone was always watching over the delicate web of human interaction. Children, when present, brought both joy and chaos. Mr. and Mrs. Patel, recent immigrants from India, had a small boy who would dart through the corridors, leaving echoes of laughter behind him. Emile would occasionally chase him down the hall, tossing him back to his mother with a reluctant smile. These moments reminded the tenants that amidst hardship, life persisted in small, beautiful ways. One particularly cold winter, the boarding house faced a crisis that revealed its true character. A fire broke out in the kitchen when a stove malfunctioned, sending smoke curling through the hallways. Panic spread among the tenants, but Mrs. Holloway's calm authority directed everyone to safety. Doors were unlocked, blankets handed out, and by morning, though parts of the kitchen were damaged, no lives were lost. The incident forged bonds that had previously existed only in passing glances and polite conversation. Neighbors checked in, strangers helped one another, and the house seemed for the first time like a true community. Over the years, the house on Cedar Street became more than just a place to sleep. It became a living chronicle of the lives of those who passed through its rooms. Love, betrayal, hardship, and triumph all unfolded within its walls. Emile eventually saved enough to rent a small shop, and Mrs. Langley found companionship in a fellow tenant who shared her love for literature. Clara performed at local concerts, while the Patel boy grew into a confident young man ready to face the wider world. And Mrs. Holloway, the silent guardian of secrets, continued her quiet vigil, ensuring that the boarding house remained a haven for anyone seeking a place to belong. Even decades later, the house would tell its stories to those who cared to listen. Passers-by might see only the brick and the windows, but inside it held the laughter, tears, and dreams of generations. Each room, each creaking floorboard, each flickering candle carried a fragment of a life once lived. And though the world outside changed, the house on Cedar Street remained steadfast, a doorway to a hidden world that few could ever truly understand, but many would never forget. The boarding house on Cedar Street was more than walls and rooms. It was a testament to human resilience, to the ways strangers could come together to form a family, and to the hidden lives that thrived behind ordinary facades. Every visitor, every tenant left a mark on the house, and in return, the house shaped them, offering sanctuary, structure, and an unexpected intimacy that the modern world would one day forget. At 74 Cedar Street, the boarding house hummed with life, but its heart and pulse were not the creaking stairs or the narrow hallways. They were Mrs. Beatrice Holloway, the landlady. To outsiders, she appeared a petite, unassuming woman with silver-streaked hair and spectacles perched perpetually on the tip of her nose. Her eyes, however, told a different story. Sharp, perceptive, and unflinching, they seemed to pierce straight through the walls and doors of the boarding house, reading the private lives of every tenant as if they were open books.
Mrs. Holloway's reputation extended far beyond the confines of Cedar Street. Neighbors spoke of her as a watchful guardian, a woman who knew who had the flu before the doctor did, who could guess with eerie accuracy which tenant was falling in love and which was slipping into despair. Yet despite this omniscience, she was neither intrusive nor judgmental. She had learned early in life that secrets, when treated with respect, could build trust, and trust could hold a household together like mortar between bricks. The boarding house itself was a microcosm of the city's struggles and dreams. Immigrants from Italy, Poland, Ireland, and later India found rooms under her roof, each one carrying their own stories of hardship, hope, and ambition. Widows, students, factory workers, and traveling salesmen all coexisted, brought together by circumstance, yet separated by walls and quiet routines. To the casual observer, life here seemed mundane, orderly, and predictable. But Mrs. Holloway knew better. She understood the subtle symphonies of whispered confessions, secret letters, stolen glances, and the late-night sobs behind closed doors. One particular morning, she walked the narrow hallway with a basket of laundry, pausing outside a door where she heard muffled sobs. Inside lived Clara, a young music student with dreams of performing in the town's grand theater. Mrs. Holloway had watched her flourish over the months, but the sorrow she sensed now told a different story. Clara had received a rejection letter from the theater's audition committee, and though she tried to hide it, her tears betrayed her. Mrs. Holloway tapped lightly on the door, entered quietly, and placed the basket down. "You'll find another opportunity," she said softly. "But for now, cry if you must. This house, it's a safe place for tears." Clara looked up, startled by the kindness that was neither intrusive nor patronizing. The landlady's presence had a way of making sorrow feel contained, manageable, and somehow less lonely. Clara's secret, her despair, remained hers, yet Mrs. Holloway had acknowledged it without asking for explanation. That was her gift. She knew the contours of each tenant's inner life without demanding disclosure. Then there was the case of Mrs. Langley, the widow living on the top floor. For months she had confided only to the walls of her room, silently grieving the loss of her husband. Mrs. Holloway, knowing the depth of her sorrow, introduced her quietly to other women in the house with similar experiences. Shared meals and whispered conversations gradually eased Mrs. Langley's isolation, and eventually she found the courage to resume life with a gentleness that surprised even herself. The landlady's intervention was invisible, yet transformative. Even the youngest residents felt Mrs. Holloway's presence. Mr. and Mrs. Patel's boy, no more than 7, would often wander into her office asking for a story or a piece of candy. She would kneel beside him, telling tales of faraway lands, inventing worlds from her memory and imagination. These stories, she believed, planted seeds of hope and curiosity, teaching children resilience long before they faced the harsh realities of work, prejudice, and survival. Her own life, however, remained a mystery to the tenants. Few knew she had once been a teacher, traveled abroad, or experienced loss that mirrored, in intensity, the struggles she now witnessed daily. Even her closest confidences were measured, shared only with the occasional trusted neighbor or her own journal. This separation allowed her to maintain a perspective that was both compassionate and objective, a rare combination in a world where empathy often came with judgment. Winter brought new challenges. Storms left snow blocking the streets, and the city seemed quieter, but the boarding house never truly slept. Tenants huddled together in shared warmth, and Mrs. Holloway ensured that coal stoves were fed, pipes did not freeze, and that no one went without hot meals. During a particularly harsh January, when illness spread quickly, she organized a nightly check-in routine. She moved quietly from room to room, delivering tea, soup, and a gentle touch to those confined by fever. In those moments, she was both healer and silent witness to the vulnerabilities that life in a boarding house inevitably exposed. One evening, a letter arrived addressed to her personally. It bore the seal of a lawyer in another city and spoke of a distant relative seeking contact after decades of estrangement. Mrs. Holloway folded the letter carefully, tucking it into a drawer in her office. She did not share this with anyone, not even her tenants, because she understood the subtle truth. Some secrets were meant for oneself, and not all knowledge required action. The choice of what to reveal, she knew, was as important as the act of knowing itself. The house thrived on its hidden lives. Lovers, dreamers, widows, immigrants, and students coexisted, their secrets weaving together to form an intricate tapestry. Mrs. Holloway's understanding of these lives made the boarding house more than a shelter. It became a sanctuary where humanity could unfold with dignity, even in anonymity. She protected, guided, and observed without imposing, creating a space where people could grow, stumble, and eventually emerge stronger. By the time the sun set over Cedar Street, the house took on a quiet, almost sacred air. Candles flickered in each window, casting shadows across walls filled with untold stories. Mrs. Holloway sat in her small office, reviewing her ledger, noting who might need extra warmth tomorrow, and which tenants could use a gentle word of encouragement. She smiled faintly, knowing that while she could never erase the hardships of life, she could offer refuge, discretion, and above all, a listening presence. The boarding house on Cedar Street owed its stability and warmth to her, its silent guardian and keeper of secrets. And while the city outside moved on with the relentless march of progress, the house remained a testament to her quiet authority, her compassion, and her unparalleled ability to navigate the delicate lives of everyone who called it home. In that world, hidden behind ordinary doors, she held the power to shape lives, not by force, but by knowledge, discretion, and unwavering care. And so the landlady continued her work, unseen but indispensable, watching over a hidden world that thrived because she understood one simple truth. The heart of a home was not walls or furniture, but the lives it sheltered, the secrets it protected, and the compassion that quietly held it all together. In the boarding house on Cedar Street, meals were more than nourishment. They were a language of unspoken agreements, a ritual that bound strangers into a fragile, functioning community. Each morning, the aroma of oatmeal, fresh bread, and boiled eggs drifted from the kitchen down the narrow hallways. Tenants stirred from their small rooms, rubbing sleep from their eyes, aware that breakfast was a time not just for eating, but for observing the rhythms of their neighbors. Mrs. Holloway presided over the kitchen with the quiet authority of someone who had seen every nuance of human behavior. She moved among the clattering pots and pans, ladling porridge into bowls with careful precision, arranging slices of bread on plates, and distributing coffee to those who could manage the hot liquid without scalding themselves. No one questioned her methods. The rules of the house were silently understood, enforced not with threats, but through the subtle weight of expectation and habit. The long wooden table in the dining room was the stage where the unspoken social hierarchy revealed itself. Regular tenants had designated seats. Emile always at the far end near the window, Marco near the center where he could interact with both newcomers and longtime residents. Hannah sat opposite Emile, occasionally swapping glances with Clara, the music student upstairs. The arrangement might seem trivial, but it was the invisible scaffolding that allowed the house to function smoothly. Sharing meals required a delicate balance. Portions were limited, so etiquette became paramount. One never took more than necessary, nor spoke louder than necessary. Conversation was measured, laughter restrained. A newcomer who overstepped these invisible boundaries risked drawing the attention of both Mrs. Holloway and the seasoned tenants. It was not cruelty, but a preservation mechanism. Too much disorder in a house where people relied on one another for space, warmth, and privacy could tip the delicate balance into chaos. Breakfast was a silent communion. Emile and Marco often exchanged nods, sharing a loaf of bread without words. Hannah poured tea for herself and a neighboring tenant, a gesture both polite and carefully observed. Mrs. Holloway circulated, adjusting placements, replenishing plates, quietly ensuring that no one went unnoticed or unserved. These small gestures held meaning. A cup of tea offered at the right moment could smooth tensions between roommates. A second slice of bread could signal trust, and a warm smile could ease the silent loneliness that crept through shared walls. Evenings were governed by similar rules, though the stakes were higher. Dinners were scarce in ingredients and timing. Tenants returned from long shifts, many exhausted, and the house collectively adjusted to accommodate fatigue, lateness, or absent-minded forgetfulness. If Emile came home too late, a modest meal might be left aside for him, quietly placed on the stove. If Hannah had spent the day washing laundry for extra income, her portion was often slightly larger, a nod from Mrs. Holloway to the unseen burdens carried by each tenant. The silent rules extended beyond the dining room. One did not enter another tenant's room unannounced. One spoke softly in the hallways after 9 in the evening. Laundry schedules were respected without complaint, and heating stoves were tended in rotation. These customs, though unstated, were enforced with a mixture of social pressure and subtle observation. A tenant who failed to observe them risked subtle correction, a disapproving glance from Mrs. Holloway, a whisper from a fellow resident, or the quiet isolation that came from repeated breaches. Yet within these constraints, warmth and connection emerged. Sharing meals created bonds as essential as the food itself. A bowl of soup passed from one roommate to another became a token of empathy. A shared slice of bread was a gesture of solidarity, an acknowledgement of struggle, and a reminder that the house's occupants were in this together, each balancing the tenuous line between survival and despair. These acts, small in isolation, collectively forged a culture of mutual care, invisible but essential. The boarding house also provided a stage for learning, particularly for newcomers. Immigrant tenants quickly absorbed the unspoken codes through observation and participation. Marco, initially unaware of the subtle timing of meal preparation, watched Emile and Hannah, gradually learning that one's actions could ease tension or spark resentment. Over time, he internalized these lessons, participating in the quiet choreography of the house, respecting its rhythms, and learning that the rules were as vital as the walls themselves. Mrs. Holloway's genius lay in balancing discretion with guidance. She rarely gave verbal commands beyond the necessary, preferring to let tenants learn through observation. Yet her presence was always felt, a quiet authority that ensured fairness and harmony. When disputes arose, perhaps over a seat at the table or a stove heated too long, she intervened delicately, redirecting attention or adjusting schedules without shaming anyone. The tenants internalized her approach, resolving minor conflicts themselves, maintaining the dignity of all involved. On one particularly cold February evening, the boarding house faced a small crisis. A new tenant, a young man from Ireland named Patrick, arrived late from work, exhausted and unfamiliar with the rules. He took a seat at the table without awareness of the delicate seating arrangements, inadvertently upsetting Marco and Emile. For a moment, tension simmered, unspoken but palpable. Mrs. Holloway quietly approached, serving Patrick a warm plate of stew and subtly indicating that he wait for the others to finish their portions. The moment passed, and harmony returned, not noticed by most, but preserved entirely through her careful orchestration. These meals, governed by silent rules, became a daily education in empathy, patience, and social navigation. Tenants learned to negotiate space, time, and attention without words, practicing diplomacy in small, essential ways. Over months and years, the customs of the dining room and hallways transformed strangers into a community, each tenant attuned to the needs, habits, and unspoken agreements of the others. The rituals extended beyond sustenance. Celebrations, when they occurred, followed the same patterns. Birthdays or holidays were acknowledged with small treats shared carefully among residents, never lavish but meaningful. Each gesture reinforced bonds, creating a culture of care that surpassed the practical necessity of shared meals. The boarding house became a microcosm of civility, where human decency, respect, and understanding could flourish even amid scarcity and hardship. Ultimately, the dining room of 74 Cedar Street was more than a place to eat. It was a classroom of subtle etiquette, a stage for empathy, and a crucible where the unspoken rules of community were learned. Tenants left not just nourished in body, but educated in the art of coexistence, ready to face the wider world with a deeper understanding of patience, observation, and quiet compassion. And when Mrs. Holloway finally blew out the last candle each night, her work for the day complete, the house settled into its characteristic hum, a rhythm of lives intertwined, governed not by strict commands, but by the delicate, enduring power of shared meals and silent rules.
As dusk fell over Cedar Street, the boarding house transformed. By day, it was a place of routine, breakfast and shared meals, the shuffle of tenants leaving for work, and the careful navigation of silent rules. But night was something entirely different. The shadows that crept along the walls carried whispers, sighs, and secrets that daylight had no business seeing. The attic room, where Emile, Marco, and Hannah shared their modest space, became a haven after long hours of labor. Here, walls absorbed the low hum of human vulnerability, a symphony of whispered stories and muted laughter. Emile sat by the small window, scratching out letters to family he had left behind in Poland. Marco hummed softly, trying to soothe a homesick ache with the memory of Italian vineyards. Hannah read aloud in Hungarian, her voice a fragile bridge connecting her present to a past she could barely hold on to. Loneliness was the companion of most who lived at 74 Cedar Street. It lingered in the shadows, tucked between the floorboards, hiding in corners, and settling over beds at night. Even amid roommates, the quiet ache of being an outsider could not be fully erased. Each tenant wrestled with the absence of loved ones, the memory of a home left behind, or the invisible pressure of building a life in a country that was both promising
and unforgiving. The evenings were often punctuated by quiet confessions. Mrs. Holloway, the observant landlady, never intruded but allowed the intimacy of these whispered stories to exist safely. Sometimes she would quietly pass a note, leave a warm cup of tea, or simply nod in recognition, acknowledging the depth of emotion without forcing exposure. Her presence was both invisible and protective, a silent guardian of the tenants' private worlds. In one small room on the second floor, Clara, the music student, plucked a violin string and let the notes drift into the hall. She had been rejected from the town's theater auditions that afternoon, and grief made her fingers tremble. Yet she played anyway, each note a whispered attempt to speak the sorrow that words could not contain. Down the hallway, Mrs. Langley, the widow, listened in silence, her own loneliness momentarily softened by the understanding that someone else, somewhere in the house, was carrying their burden alone, yet bravely. Whispers moved like a secret river through the house. Tenants shared fragments of lives they dared not speak aloud in public. A young man confessing to the shame of a debt, a woman revealing the fear of losing her children to illness, an immigrant quietly mourning the distance from home. Each disclosure was fleeting, delicate, and private, yet these whispered stories became a quiet thread connecting the lives in the house. The act of sharing, even in hushed tones, created community and solace in a space otherwise dominated by isolation. The attic often became a stage for these exchanges. Emil, Marco, and Hannah would sit cross-legged on the floor, exchanging stories of family traditions, childhood memories, and fleeting hopes. Marco told tales of the harvest season in Italy, of grape-stained hands and laughter under sunlit skies. Emil spoke of winter nights in Krakow, of snow so deep that children disappeared in it, yet found ways to play. Hannah recounted the grand streets of Budapest, the street performers and the markets alive with color and life. These narratives, whispered into the night, created a tapestry of shared humanity, binding them closer despite cultural and linguistic divides. But the nights also held isolation. There were tenants who preferred silence, who pressed their faces to the pillow and stared at the ceiling, weighing the gap between their dreams and reality. Some wrote letters home that would never be sent, or recorded their thoughts in journals that smelled faintly of ink and coal smoke. Loneliness in this house was not shameful, it was inevitable. Yet within that inevitability lay the potential for connection, if one were brave enough to whisper their story, and another brave enough to listen. Sometimes neighbors' voices carried through the thin walls, a child crying in the next room, a coughing adult battling illness, or the faint melody of a foreign song floated across the corridors. These sounds, at first intrusive, became part of the night's rhythm, a reminder that even in solitude, lives were intertwined. The boarding house was alive in subtle ways. The creak of a floorboard, the rustle of paper, the muffled laughter or sighs from rooms closed tight. Each sound was a testament to human endurance and quiet courage. Mrs. Holloway understood that these nights were critical. They allowed tenants to process, to mourn, to hope, and to dream in ways the daylight would not permit. She sometimes stayed awake herself, sitting in the dim light of her office, listening to the gentle pulse of the house, offering small interventions if necessary. A forgotten candle might be relit, a note slipped under a door, a blanket quietly placed on a shivering tenant. These acts of kindness that never demanded acknowledgement, yet carried profound weight. The nights were also where aspirations quietly grew. Emile sketched designs for a tailor shop, his pencil tracing plans that would one day lift him from factory labor. Marco practiced English and planned a bakery, his dreams moving steadily from imagination to tangible possibility. Hannah stitched delicate patterns in candlelight, dreaming of dresses that would one day adorn women in the city. These whispered stories were not complaints, but seeds of ambition, nurtured in a space that combined safety with invisibility. Winter nights were the harshest, yet often the most revealing. Snowstorms trapped tenants indoors, leaving them to rely entirely on each other's presence for warmth. Stories became longer, conversations deeper, and the sense of community stronger. The shared experience of isolation paradoxically reduced the sense of loneliness. Even those who did not speak were part of the collective rhythm. A single cough, a sigh, or whispered story echoed in solidarity, reminding all that while life was difficult, no one faced it entirely alone. By the time the first light of dawn seeped through the windows, the night's whispered stories left traces on hearts. Bonds were strengthened, empathy deepened, and the house on Cedar Street stood not only as shelter, but as a keeper of private histories. Each tenant had navigated their loneliness, found courage in shared humanity, and discovered that even in silence there was comfort. And so the boarding house's nights continued, endlessly repeating the delicate balance between hidden solitude and quiet connection. Tenants would rise in the morning with the weight of yesterday's labor, but also with the invisible reassurance that the night had held their truths safely, shared only to those who chose to listen, and guarded by the gentle vigilance of Mrs. Holloway. In the end, the nights on Cedar Street were not simply the absence of light. They were a sanctuary for whispered stories, a stage for unspoken dreams, and a space where hidden loneliness could be softened by the quiet presence of others who understood, if only in passing, the fragile human heart.
The dawn at 74 Cedar Street arrived not with serenity, but with the clatter of industry. The boarding house seemed to awaken as if its walls themselves understood the daily rhythm of labor. Emile rose before sunrise, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and checking the small tin lunch pail his mother had sent from Poland. The pail was dented and worn, yet it held sustenance enough for the 12-hour shift he faced in the textile mill. Survival here demanded diligence, endurance, and a willingness to trade comfort for opportunity. Marco, the young baker from Italy, was already in motion, his hands raw from kneading dough the night before and shaping loaves that would be sold before breakfast. For him, each day was a delicate balance: maintain the strength to work long hours, improve his English, and save enough money to one day rent a small shop where he could sell bread without compromise. Each loaf carried not only sustenance for the city, but the weight of ambition, the invisible tally of sacrifice he was willing to make to carve a life in this new world. Hannah, the Hungarian seamstress, quietly adjusted the hem of a dress as the morning light spilled through the attic window. She would leave shortly for the factory, where she and dozens of other women labored over garments that would eventually adorn the wealthy. Each stitch required precision, speed, and relentless endurance. Mistakes could mean lost wages or the humiliation of a stern supervisor. She kept her head down, focusing on the rhythmic motions, knowing that every seam was a step closer to stability, even if it barely covered rent and meals. Mrs. Holloway's presence in the boarding house provided a subtle kind of supervision. She understood that work and survival were intertwined, that each tenant's wages dictated the tone of the household. A missed day's labor could ripple through the community: delayed rent, shared meals strained by scarcity, tempers frayed by exhaustion. She moved among them quietly, offering bread or a cup of coffee when she sensed fatigue, ensuring that the price of survival did not tip into despair. The city outside was relentless. Factories roared with machinery, black smoke curled into the sky, and workers pressed into overcrowded streetcars on their way to jobs that demanded speed, strength, and compliance. Boarding house life was the counterpoint, a small enclave where tenants could rest, eat, and prepare for the grind. Yet even here, the pressures of work were never absent. Conversations often centered on wages, gossip about supervisors, and rumors of layoffs. Each tenant navigated the fine line between earning enough to survive and preserving health and dignity. Emil's work in the textile mill was grueling, looms planged with mechanical precision, threatening fingers that moved too slowly or carelessly. He often returned home with cuts on his hands, shoulders aching, and fatigue heavy in his bones. Yet he carried with him the faint glow of purpose, the promise of a tailor shop, of autonomy beyond factory walls. Survival demanded sacrifice, and each day he measured the cost, pain endured, hours lost, yet wages that promised incremental freedom. Marco faced similar struggles. In the bakery, the early mornings were long, the heat oppressive, and the supervisors unforgiving. Mistakes were corrected with loud rebukes. A dropped loaf could mean lost pay or a reprimand in front of other workers. Yet Marco took pride in his craft. Each loaf was a testament to skill, patience, and hope. The price of survival was high, but it was a price he willingly paid, dreaming of a future where he could work on his own terms. Hana's factory work was no less exacting. The long rows of machines demanded speed, her fingers raw from repeated motion. Supervisors moved like shadows, measuring efficiency, monitoring errors. She learned quickly that compliance and silence were necessary tools, while camaraderie among other workers provided solace against the relentless pace. Their shared endurance became a small shield, a collective acknowledgement that survival was a task that could be softened, if only slightly, by mutual support. Beyond the physical labor, the financial calculus of survival weighed heavily on all tenants. Rent, coal for heating, food, and small personal expenses left little room for leisure or indulgence. Any deviation, a sick day, a mismanaged budget, an emergency, threatened to destabilize the fragile balance. Mrs. Holloway, understanding these stakes, often allowed minor leniencies. A delayed rent payment, if explained discreetly, would be absorbed into her ledger. Extra portions of food would be offered to those who worked longest or had least. Survival required both effort and subtle negotiation, a careful navigation of social and economic terrain. Yet work was not only toil, it was also identity. Emil's fingers traced fabric patterns even in moments of exhaustion, reminding him of the dream he carried in his heart. Marco spoke quietly to Hana about the bakeries of Italy, imagining the aroma of fresh bread in a shop he could one day call his own. Hana sketched patterns in her mind, planning dresses and designs she hoped to sell when she saved enough to leave the factory. Work, in its grueling repetition, was also the medium through which dreams could survive, however tenuous the hold. Evenings in the boarding house were a relief and a reflection. Tenants returned weary, yet the small rituals of shared dinner, washing, and conversation provided comfort. They spoke cautiously of their work, of challenges faced, of supervisors' moods and the shifting pace of orders. In these exchanges, advice and camaraderie were quietly traded, tips on avoiding reprimand, strategies for speed, and encouragement to endure. The collective knowledge of survival circulated, unspoken but deeply understood. Yet the price of survival was not only measured in wages, it exacted a toll on bodies, hearts, and minds. Fatigue hardened expressions, injuries lingered longer than they should, and sleep became a scarce luxury. Loneliness coexisted with community,
fears of the unknown future weighed as heavily as the labor itself. Boarding house life provided structure, yes, but it could not erase the existential cost of earning one's place in the world. Despite these hardships, hope persisted. Each paycheck, modest though it might be, represented progress. Each small act of thrift, saving a portion of wages, sharing food, repairing a garment, was a conscious effort to build stability. The tenants understood that survival was not merely about work completed, but about careful management, endurance, and foresight. Life at 74 Cedar Street demanded vigilance, but it also rewarded persistence, resilience, and quiet determination. And when night fell, and the house settled into its creaking, shadowed rhythm, Emile, Marco, Hannah, and the others understood that they had paid the price of survival with every ounce of their effort. Yet within that price was pride, hope, and the knowledge that each day's work was a stepping stone toward a life beyond the boarding house. It was a cost they bore willingly for the promise of a future shaped by their own hands, a life where wages could translate into freedom and survival could eventually become something more than mere endurance.
The boarding house on Cedar Street was a sanctuary by day, but by night it became a theater of secrets. Behind the closed doors of its narrow hallways, lives intertwined in ways both thrilling and precarious. For the tenants, whispers of scandal were never publicized. They existed in a delicate balance of discretion, rumor, and the silent watchfulness of Mrs. Holloway. One evening, Emile returned from the mill later than usual, his hands raw and his shoulders stiff. He had noticed unusual glances between Marco and a new tenant, Rosa, a seamstress from southern Italy. At first, it was merely a shared smile in the kitchen, but gradually, Emile observed furtive touches of the hand, hurried conversations at odd hours, and the subtle blush that colored Rosa's cheeks when Marco was near. The boarding house had rules, silent but strict, and these quiet rebellions of the heart carried risk. Hannah, perceptive and quietly observant, noticed too. She sensed the undercurrent of tension that wove through the attic room and corridors. Whispered stories floated in the hallways, often without words, the soft laughter behind closed doors, the hurried footfalls, the subtle rearrangements of furniture to shield prying eyes. Boarding house life depended on discretion, and the tenants learned quickly that exposure could lead to humiliation, confrontation, or even eviction. Mrs. Holloway, however, knew every nuance of these unfolding dramas. She had seen countless affairs, secret alliances, and whispered betrayals in her decades managing the house. She understood that curiosity could easily tip into destruction, and she navigated these scandals with the precision of a seasoned diplomat. One gentle word here, a timely distraction there, and she could prevent minor indiscretions from erupting into catastrophic conflict. The most delicate scandal involved a tenant named Samuel, a clerk who had courted Mrs. Langley, the widow living on the top floor. Their companionship had remained unnoticed until Samuel's letters from a distant city were intercepted by another tenant who intended to expose the relationship. Tension simmered in the house, and Mrs. Holloway intervened with quiet authority. She rearranged schedules, suggested errands that kept the curious away, and subtly guided Samuel and Mrs. Langley to discreet meetings. In the end, the affair continued in privacy, unscathed by gossip, its existence known only to the two involved and the ever-watchful landlady. Meanwhile, Marco and Rosa's relationship blossomed behind closed doors. Notes were exchanged under the table during shared meals. Fleeting touches in hallways were carefully concealed from neighbors. The attic room's window, partially obscured by thick curtains, became a haven for whispered conversations. Every gesture carried weight, every glance risk. Their romance was intoxicating, yet precarious, a constant negotiation between desire and discretion, unfolding under the silent scrutiny of both Mrs. Holloway and the other tenants. Whispers were not always romantic. Occasionally, disputes and minor betrayals emerged, cloaked in secrecy. Emile discovered that a portion of his bread had gone missing from the shared kitchen, a small act of theft, yet one that carried significant emotional weight in a house where every resource was carefully rationed. He confronted the matter quietly, and Mrs. Holloway's intervention ensured that accountability was maintained without public humiliation. These moments reinforced the house's invisible social code. Actions mattered, but discretion was paramount. Even the children of the tenants contributed to the web of secrets. Mr. and Mrs. Patel's boy occasionally discovered notes, glimpsed hidden meetings, or overheard hushed arguments. Children, naturally curious, became both witnesses and unintentional keepers of scandal. Mrs. Holloway managed these situations deftly, redirecting attention, offering stories or tasks to occupy the mind, and ensuring that the fragile equilibrium of the boarding house remained intact. The nights were the most intense. As darkness cloaked the house, tenants moved quietly through hallways, careful not to awaken or alert others. The attic room, once a shared space for study and leisure, became a chamber of secrets. Marco and Rosa exchanged folded notes. Emile sketched plans for his tailor shop while hiding them beneath the floorboard, and Hannah recorded her thoughts in a journal, aware that even private writings could be discovered. The act of hiding, of preserving one's secrets, became both a necessity and a form of survival. Mrs. Holloway maintained an intricate balance. She allowed small indiscretions to unfold, provided protection for those who were vulnerable, and occasionally applied subtle corrections when necessary. She understood that secrecy was not inherently immoral. It was often survival, passion, or the assertion of personal dignity in a society that limited choice. The boarding house became a sanctuary for these small rebellions, a place where scandal was contained, human desires acknowledged, and consequences managed discreetly. One particularly tense evening, Emile overheard a conversation between Rosa and Marco about a potential move to another city. Their excitement and fear were palpable, yet the conversation risked exposure in the crowded boarding house. Emile debated whether to reveal what he had heard, but Mrs. Holloway's wisdom prevailed in his thoughts. Silence, discretion, and understanding were often the better path. That night, he merely nodded to himself, leaving them to their plans, and allowed the private world behind closed doors to remain untouched. The boarding house on Cedar Street thrived in this delicate tension between visibility and secrecy. Scandals, when handled with care, became part of the human texture of life. They were neither shameful nor destructive in the hands of those who understood subtlety. Behind each door, emotions surged, dreams were pursued, and private lives unfolded in parallel to the structured routines of meals, chores, and labor. The house was a stage for countless hidden dramas, each one carefully managed to maintain peace and continuity. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the windows, the night's scandals had dissolved into routine once again. Letters were tucked away, meetings concluded, and stolen moments transformed into memories. Life at the boarding house continued, enriched by the human complexities that had played out unseen. And though gossip occasionally sparked between tenants, Mrs. Holloway's quiet oversight ensured that discretion remained the foundation of community life. In the end, the boarding house became a sanctuary for both public life and private desire. Scandals behind closed doors were not destructive, but illuminating, revealing the humanity of each tenant and the delicate negotiations required to live in close quarters. The house, guided by Mrs. Holloway's keen awareness, held the secrets with care, shaping lives in ways the world outside could never perceive. Within its walls, romance, ambition, loyalty, and small betrayals coexisted in harmony, creating a hidden tapestry of human resilience, discretion, and survival. The boarding house at 74 Cedar Street had endured many small challenges, but the year brought a crisis unlike any before. Rumors of economic panic spread through the city like wildfire. Factories slowed production, wages were delayed, and the streets became crowded with anxious workers. At the same time, a virulent influenza made its way through the neighborhoods, leaving fever and cough in its wake. And, as if the city's misfortunes were not enough, a fire broke out in a nearby building, sending smoke and panic into every window. The tenants of Cedar Street suddenly found themselves navigating more than just daily survival. They were confronting disaster. Mrs. Holloway moved quickly, her decades of experience managing the household now indispensable. She gathered tenants in the narrow hallway, quietly explaining precautionary measures. "Keep calm," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. "Lock your doors, secure your belongings, and check on one another." She handed out extra blankets, ensured the stoves were fed, and arranged small meals for those too ill to move from their rooms. In a house of strangers and immigrants, her leadership became the linchpin that held everything together. The fire from the nearby building cast an orange glow across the city, reflecting in the windows of the boarding house. Emil, Marco, and Hannah huddled near the attic window, watching flames lick the night sky. Smoke seeped into the hallways, and the acrid smell stung their lungs. Neighbors banged on doors, warning of danger, but Mrs. Holloway maintained calm authority. "We are safe here," she said firmly. "Stay inside. Panic will not help us." Her certainty grounded the tenants, giving them courage when fear threatened to overwhelm reason. The influenza outbreak was less visible, but no less dangerous. It crept silently from room to room, claiming strength and leaving fever in its wake. Clara, the music student, became one of the first affected, shivering and weak in her bed. Mrs. Holloway quietly checked on her, delivering warm tea and broth, moving silently to avoid spreading worry. Hannah assisted, holding damp cloths to Clara's forehead and whispering soothing words. In the boarding house, care was a communal responsibility, yet managed delicately to respect each tenant's privacy. Illness required both vigilance and discretion, and the house adapted quickly to meet these twin demands. Economic panic added another layer of tension. Factory wages slowed, bread prices rose, and some tenants faced eviction. Emil fretted over his savings, knowing that a lost paycheck could compromise the delicate balance of rent, coal, and food. Marco calculated how to stretch a small sum to cover both necessities and the possibility of leaving for better opportunities. Hannah rationed her modest earnings, setting aside a small reserve in case sickness or misfortune struck again. The boarding house, normally a place of routine, became a hub of crisis management. Despite the compounding crises, the tenants found ways to maintain dignity and mutual support. Shared meals became more strategic, portions carefully distributed to ensure no one went hungry. The attic room, usually a haven for whispered stories, became a sanctuary for planning and quiet collaboration. Emil sketched budgets and plans for selling small garments. Marco measured flour and bread, calculating how to survive the rising prices. Hannah stitched mending work to supplement her income. Survival demanded ingenuity, cooperation, and careful foresight. Yet even in hardship, human resilience shone. The fire forced some tenants to temporarily share rooms, creating a closeness that had not existed before. Conversations deepened, whispered confessions became lifelines, and small acts of kindness carried immense significance. A bowl of hot soup for a fevered neighbor, a loaf of bread divided between two families, or a blanket shared quietly on a cold night, all became tokens of survival and human compassion. Mrs. Holloway's vigilance was crucial. She checked each room multiple times a day, ensuring heat, food, and medicine were adequate. She arranged the tenants' schedules to minimize exposure to illness and danger. When the fire threatened the nearby street, she coordinated a temporary relocation of belongings, moved valuables to safer floors, and instructed tenants in emergency procedures. Her presence was quiet but commanding, and the boarding house relied on her judgment for both physical and emotional safety. The influenza outbreak tested the house's endurance. Some tenants were bedridden for days, their coughs echoing down the narrow hallways. Hannah and Emil rotated shifts, attending to the sick, while ensuring their own tasks were. The boarding house at 74 Cedar Street had endured many small challenges, but the year brought a crisis unlike any before. Rumors of economic panic spread through the city like wildfire. Factories slowed production, wages were delayed, and the streets became crowded with anxious workers. At the same time, a virulent influenza made its way through the neighborhoods, leaving fever and cough in its wake. And, as if the city's misfortunes were not enough, a fire broke out in a nearby building, sending smoke and panic into every window. The tenants of Cedar Street suddenly found themselves navigating more than just daily survival. They were confronting disaster. Mrs. Holloway moved quickly, her decades of experience managing the household now indispensable. She gathered tenants in the narrow hallway, quietly explaining precautionary measures. "Keep calm," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. "Lock your doors, secure your belongings, and check on one another." She handed out extra blankets, ensured the stoves were fed, and arranged small meals for those too ill to move from their rooms. In a house of strangers and immigrants, her leadership became the linchpin that held everything together. The fire from the nearby building cast an orange glow across the city, reflecting in the windows of the boarding house. Emil, Marco, and Hannah huddled near the attic window, watching flames lick the night sky. Smoke seeped into the hallways, and the acrid smell stung their lungs. Neighbors banged on doors, warning of danger, but Mrs. Holloway maintained calm authority. "We are safe here," she said firmly. "Stay inside. Panic will not help us." Her certainty grounded the tenants, giving them courage when fear threatened to overwhelm reason. The influenza outbreak was less visible, but no less dangerous. It crept silently from room to room, claiming strength and leaving fever in its wake. Clara, the music student, became one of the first affected, shivering and weak in her bed. Mrs. Holloway quietly checked on her, delivering warm tea and broth, moving silently to avoid spreading worry. Hannah assisted, holding damp cloths to Clara's forehead and whispering soothing words. In the boarding house, care was a communal responsibility, yet managed delicately to respect each tenant's privacy. Illness required both vigilance and discretion, and the house adapted quickly to meet these twin demands. Economic panic added another layer of tension. Factory wages slowed, bread prices rose, and some tenants faced eviction. Emil fretted over his savings, knowing that a lost paycheck could compromise the delicate balance of rent, coal, and food. Marco calculated how to stretch a small sum to cover both necessities and the possibility of leaving for better opportunities. Hannah rationed her modest earnings, setting aside a small reserve in case sickness or misfortune struck again. The boarding house, normally a place of routine, became a hub of crisis management. Despite the compounding crises, the tenants found ways to maintain dignity and mutual support. Shared meals became more strategic, portions carefully distributed to ensure no one went hungry. The attic room, usually a haven for whispered stories, became a sanctuary for planning and quiet collaboration. Emile sketched budgets and plans for selling small garments. Marco measured flour and bread, calculating how to survive the rising prices. Hannah stitched mending work to supplement her income. Survival demanded ingenuity, cooperation, and careful foresight. Yet even in hardship, human resilience shone. The fire forced some tenants to temporarily share rooms, creating a closeness that had not existed before. Conversations deepened, whispered confessions became lifelines, and small acts of kindness carried immense significance. A bowl of hot soup for a fevered neighbor, a loaf of bread divided between two families, or the boarding house on Cedar Street had long been a place of transient faces and temporary stays. Strangers arrived with suitcases heavy with memories, wallets light with coins, and hearts full of hope. Yet over the years, those same walls had witnessed the extraordinary transformation of strangers into family, bound not by blood, but by shared struggles, small triumphs, and unspoken loyalty. It began quietly. Emile, the young tailor from Poland, had spent his first months at 74 Cedar Street in polite isolation, keeping to himself and focusing on his sketches and letters to family far away. Marco, the Italian baker, was equally reserved, balancing work, language lessons, and the occasional misstep in social etiquette. Hannah, the Hungarian seamstress, maintained the careful distance, focused on her factory job and her private dreams. Each tenant carried their solitude like armor, wary of exposure, protective of privacy. The first crack in their walls appeared over shared meals. Breakfast, once a time of quiet observation, became a subtle space for connection. Emile offered a slice of bread to Marco one morning, a gesture of simple goodwill. Marco responded with a warm smile and an extra cup of tea for Hannah. The act, small and seemingly inconsequential, was the first thread woven into the tapestry of trust that would bind them together. From that morning onward, meals were no longer mere sustenance. They were opportunities for camaraderie, laughter, and subtle acts of care. Evenings became the real test of connection. The attic room, once silent and solitary, transformed into a space of shared stories. Emile recounted his childhood in Krakow, of snow-covered streets and small markets alive with color. Marco described harvest seasons in the Italian countryside, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the sun-warmed fields. Hannah told tales of Budapest, of grand boulevards and bustling marketplaces. Listening, they discovered similarities in fear, ambition, and the yearning for a life better than the one left behind. Each narrative was a bridge, shortening the distance between strangers. Challenges, as they often do, accelerated intimacy. A particularly harsh winter left the attic freezing, and coal became a precious commodity. Mrs. Holloway, recognizing the need for collaboration, suggested pooling resources. Emile, Marco, and Hannah shared their small reserves, ensuring warmth and comfort for each other. That winter became the first true test of their willingness to act as family. Sacrifice and compromise replaced hesitation and guarded solitude. From that point onward, they no longer merely coexisted, they protected one another. Shared hardships extended beyond the material. Illness, overwork, and personal despair created invisible burdens that the roommates learned to detect. When Marco fell ill with a fever after a night spent kneading dough, Emil and Hannah took turns tending to him, bringing soup, warm blankets, and whispered encouragement. When Hannah received a letter with bad news from home, Marco and Emil offered distraction, conversation, and silent support. They learned that family was not defined by shared blood, but by shared presence, care, and steadfastness in the face of life's adversity. Moments of joy, though rarer than the trials, were treasured and celebrated collectively. On a warm spring evening, Emil managed to finish a set of designs for a small tailor shop he dreamed of opening. Marco had baked a particularly fragrant loaf, and Hannah had stitched a small keepsake for the occasion. They gathered in the attic room, sharing bread, tea, and laughter. For the first time, they felt the full weight and warmth of belonging, a confirmation that the walls of the boarding house could shelter more than bodies, they could nurture hearts. The bonds extended beyond the trio. Other tenants, initially distant, observed the evolving relationships and were gradually drawn into the network of trust and care. Children played freely in the hallways under the watchful eyes of multiple adults, mischief tolerated as a form of communal joy. Neighbors assisted one another with errands, repairs, or financial emergencies. The boarding house, once merely a building of rooms and narrow corridors, became a living organism, sustained by empathy, shared responsibility, and the silent understanding that life was easier when approached together. Strangers became family through acts both large and small. The arrival of new tenants required orientation not only to household rules, but to the emotional rhythms of the community. Emil guided newcomers to shared mealtimes and quiet study areas. Marco offered advice on work and saving wages, and Hannah provided guidance in domestic chores or sewing assistance. Each act was an invitation to belong, a demonstration that trust and care were currency far more valuable than money. Perhaps the most poignant transformation occurred when a fire broke out in a nearby building. Tenants of the boarding house, longtime residents, and newcomers alike rallied instinctively. Windows were closed, belongings secured, and neighbors checked for safety. No one hesitated. Strangers who had arrived only days prior held blankets for the frightened children of others. Roommates carried the sick and elderly to safer spaces. In those moments, the line between stranger and family vanished entirely, replaced by instinctual loyalty and courage. By the time the fire was extinguished and life returned to its measured rhythm, the attic room had become more than a space for sleep and work. It had become a repository of memories, shared laughter, tears, and quiet confidences. Emil, Marco, and Hannah had learned to anticipate each other's needs without words, to celebrate triumphs, and to soothe anxieties. They had discovered that family was not inherited, it was chosen, nurtured, and defended. Years later, when some tenants moved on to better jobs or homes, the bonds forged in the boarding house endured. Letters crossed oceans and cities, visits were planned, and memories of shared winters, whispered stories, and small kindnesses remained vivid. The boarding house had been the crucible in which strangers became family, an enduring testament to the power of empathy, trust, and the shared human experience. And so, Cedar Street continued to welcome strangers, each arriving with a suitcase full of dreams and a heart cautious of trust. Yet within those walls, they could learn that family was more than blood, more than name. It was presence, care, and unwavering support in the face of life's relentless challenges. In the quiet of the attic room and in the warmth of shared meals, whispered stories, and small mutual sacrifice, strangers discovered the profound truth. Together, they could endure, thrive, and ultimately become family. The morning sun spilled through the tall windows of 74 Cedar Street with a melancholy glow. For decades, the boarding house had been alive with chatter, footsteps, and the rhythm of countless lives intersecting under one roof. Today, however, a quiet hush seemed to settle over the rooms and hallways, as if the house itself sensed the final chapter of its story. The last boarder was leaving, and with them, an era was ending. Emil packed his modest belongings with care. The small wooden trunk he had carried from Poland, battered yet sturdy, held not only his possessions, but memories of years spent navigating life in a foreign city. Sketches of tailor designs, letters from home, and small keepsakes lined the corners, tangible reminders of the community he had grown to love. Each item held a story: the loaf of bread shared with Marco, the warm tea Hannah had brought on a cold evening, the whispered confidences of late nights in the attic room. Marco moved quietly through the kitchen, collecting the last of his baking supplies. The room smelled faintly of yeast and sugar, scents that had defined his mornings for years. He lingered for a moment at the window, gazing at the narrow street below, where children had once played and neighbors had hurried past. He remembered long conversations of dreams and fears, the subtle glances exchanged during shared meals, and the quiet laughter that had echoed through hallways. The boarding house had been more than a building. It had been a crucible of resilience, friendship, and belonging. Hannah folded the last of her garments, carefully arranging them in a suitcase. She paused, brushing a hand over the worn table where they had spent hours mending clothes, writing letters, and sharing whispered stories. The space felt impossibly empty now, stripped of the daily bustle that had given life to the rooms. She realized that the boarding house had been a teacher, a refuge, and a witness to personal triumphs and private sorrows. Its walls had absorbed laughter, grief, romance, and ambition, all quietly recorded in the rhythm of everyday life. Mrs. Holloway, older now and moving more slowly, observed the preparations with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She had managed the house through decades of arrivals, departures, crises, and celebrations. She understood the profound weight of these final moments. Each tenant who had passed through her doors had left a mark, and each departure had altered the fabric of the house. The last boarder's exit signaled not only the end of their stay, but the closure of countless intertwined stories. The hallways, once full of clattering footsteps and hurried errands, were silent. Doors that had swung open countless times now remained shut, each lock turning with finality. The familiar creak of stairs and the faint hum of cooking fires were absent, leaving only the ghostly echo of memories. Even the furniture seemed subdued, its wear and scratches now testifying to the years of human life it had supported. Every item, the wooden table, the chairs, the small stoves, stood as silent witnesses to decades of ordinary yet extraordinary moments. As Emil closed the door to his room for the last time, he lingered in the hall, taking in the subtle details that had become familiar over the years: the chipped paint near the windowsill, the tiny cracks in the floorboards, and the faded wallpaper that once had been bright with color. Emil appeared behind him carrying his trunk, and Hannah followed with her own suitcase. The three of them exchanged quiet smiles, a recognition of shared history and unspoken gratitude. They had arrived as strangers and had departed as something resembling family. The front door of the boarding house creaked as it swung open. Outside, the street was unchanged, yet the perception of it was transformed. The familiar world felt suddenly unfamiliar without the daily rhythm of the house to anchor it. Emile stepped onto the sidewalk, trunk in hand, and paused. He took a deep breath, absorbing the sounds and smells of the city. Streetcars clanging in the distance, vendors calling their wares, coal smoke rising from chimneys. These everyday details, once background noise, now seemed vivid, infused with the weight of years of experience and the bittersweet nostalgia of departure. Marco and Hannah followed, each step echoing the finality of the moment. Mrs. Holloway appeared at the doorway, holding a small tin of cookies as a farewell gift, a gesture that spoke volumes of her care. Her eyes were bright yet tinged with sorrow, reflecting decades of unseen labor, overseeing meals, managing conflicts, tending to illness, and quietly guiding the moral compass of her tenants. The house had been her life, and its closure marked the end of an era she had nurtured with patience and steadfastness. The three tenants paused on the sidewalk, looking back at the building that had sheltered them through winters, illnesses, and personal trials. Windows reflected the morning light, silent and inscrutable. The memories surged like a tide. Laughter shared over bread, whispered late-night conversations, quiet acts of generosity, the grief of illness, and the thrill of small personal triumphs. It was impossible to disentangle individual memories from the collective experience of living within these walls. The house had shaped them, and they, in turn, shaped the house. As they walked away, the street seemed emptier than ever. Cedar Street had always been crowded with the movements of people, the hum of life, and the minor chaos of daily existence. Now the boarding house stood quiet, its windows reflecting the sun, the door locked, and the staircases empty. Within those walls, countless stories had played out, dreams nurtured, friendships forged, ambitions pursued, and private sorrows endured. And yet, in the silence, a profound dignity remained, a testament to the endurance of human connection within a fragile, transient space. The departure of the last boarder was more than a literal event. It was symbolic. The era of communal living, shared struggle, and intimate connection in this particular house had ended. A new world loomed beyond Cedar Street, one of apartments, modern conveniences, and more transient arrangements. Yet the lessons of the boarding house, the value of empathy, quiet solidarity, and human resilience remained. Emile, Marco, and Hannah carried them forward, seeds planted by years of lived experience that would flourish in their future endeavors. As they disappeared down the street, Mrs. Holloway lingered on the threshold, gazing at the empty windows and the silent staircases. She felt both sorrow and satisfaction. The house had fulfilled its purpose, nurturing strangers into a makeshift family, sheltering dreams, and providing a stage for the complex drama of human life. Its legacy would persist in the hearts of those who had lived there, in letters, memories, and stories told and retold over the years. The boarding house on Cedar Street would remain, a quiet monument to an era defined by shared struggle, intimacy, and community. Its walls, stairs, and rooms stood ready to welcome others, though the rhythm and warmth it once held might never fully return. For Emile, Marco, Hannah, and countless others, the house had been more than shelter. It had been the crucible of their resilience, the home of their fledgling dreams, and the anchor of a world in which strangers had learned, through necessity and care, to become family.